Today, we'll be looking at the mysterious disappearance of Don Lewis, the ex-husband of Big Cat Rescue's Carole Baskin of Tiger King fame. This video will contain some spoilers for the Netflix show Tiger King, so keep that in mind. A portion of the backstory comes from Carole Baskin herself, so it's difficult to know what's true and what's not. So keep an open mind to the information about her backstory. I've made some timestamps in the comments and description in case you want to skip to the disappearance and theories. All sources I've used for this information can be found in the description, and everything I use is protected by fair use. Thank you. Jack Donald Lewis was born in Dade City, Florida, April 30th, 1938. He became a self-made millionaire throughout his life, making his money through several business ventures ranging from real estate, the sale of scrap metal, selling cars, and even mechanical parts. In the documentary Tiger King, it was said that if Don touched it, it made money. The man was wealthy, especially for the time, and the amount of money he made was estimated between $5 and $20 million. Don Lewis was secretive with his money, so nobody really knew how much wealth he had accumulated. Not even his own lawyer knew how much he made, only able to come up with an estimate of at least $5 million in the documentary. Probably a contributing factor to his wealth was his desire to hoard his money and only really spend it frugally when it came to necessities. While the man owned a lot of properties and items such as planes, he was known for his frugality, such as buying his clothes from yard sales, and even with the wedding ring he would eventually propose to Carole with, a $14 cheap ring. He was also secretive with his possessions, and was said to have hidden large parts of his wealth, such as burying money and keeping his properties secret. Prior to his big cat ventures, Don Lewis had a marriage with a woman named Gladys Lewis Cross, which resulted in 4 children, an adopted son and 3 daughters. Despite his marriage and his wife's love for him, Don Lewis was known to engage in extramarital affairs. His former assistant Anne McQueen even claimed that she might be the only woman he wasn't fooling around with. Lewis owned properties in Costa Rica and would often travel abroad to engage in these affairs, which he had gained a reputation for. It was this disposition to cheat which would lead him to meet a 20-year-old woman by the name of Carole. Carole was born into a poor religious family in Bexar County, Texas. She was born on the Lackland Air Force Base. Carole was always a fan of wild animals from an early age and wanted to become a vet, but was put off by the idea of euthanizing the animals, a trait that would live past her childhood. At the age of 14, Carole was sexually assaulted by 3 men. When she told her parents about the incident, because of their conservative Christian upbringing, they gave her no sympathy or support after the incident. At 15 years old, she left home, dropping out of high school. She hitchhiked between states and had gone to sleeping underneath parked vehicles before purchasing a truck, which she then used to sleep in with her pet cat. Later on, Carole met a man who would become her first husband, named Michael Murdoch, who had been her boss at a department store she started working at in Tampa, Florida. Carole had a daughter with the man and married him after moving in with him at the age of 17. Michael Murdoch was abusive towards Carole, and while Carole wanted to leave the man, she was too afraid of the consequences of raising a child by herself. So she stuck with him until eventually they got into a fight and Carole fled their home. In 1983, at the age of 20, Carole was walking down the street of Nebraska Avenue in Tampa, Florida, when a car pulled up next to her. A man had asked her to get inside and, initially, Carole refused, as getting in a car with a random man down a street known for its abundance of escorts seemed pretty sketchy. But the man who went by the name of Bob Martin had tried to ease her nerves by handing her a gun and told her to hold it to his head, saying that he just wanted someone to talk to. Carole obliged, and they set off, talking and eventually falling in love. The man's name was, of course, Don Lewis. Carole Baskin stayed married to her husband for a while longer, eventually getting divorced, with Lewis getting divorced in 1989 by Gladys's request. Carole and Don married in 1991 in a courthouse wedding. A year after their wedding, in 1992, Lewis had bought Carole a bobcat from a breeder who had apparently planned to euthanize the cat. The year after that, they decided that they needed a friend for the cat, and once again, went to buy more cats. They ended up purchasing upwards of 50 big cats, before then buying more and more. Carole enjoyed the company of the cats, and Don enjoyed collecting them. They opened the Wildlife and Easy Street Sanctuary in Florida in 1995, a 40-acre plot of land that they used to house the cats. They acquired licenses and became a non-profit organization with the stated purpose of acquisition, shelter, feeding, breeding, and socialization of exotic and non-exotic animals, and awareness to benefit their wild counterparts. Later, this sanctuary became Big Cat Rescue, which Carole runs with her new husband, Howard Baskin, and they adopted the goal to end private ownership, exploitative cub petting, breeding of big cats, and pushed forward conservation efforts. Despite this, they have gained heavy criticism from opponents, accusing them of using the same tactics as the private zoos, also being accused of trying to cut out competition, with the bulk of criticism coming from the former owner of Winewood, Oklahoma, GW Zoo, Joseph Maldonado Passage, better known as Joe Exotic. And in fairness, they did expand their zoo to a bed and breakfast, allowing guests to stay the night with a young big cat. Don Lewis allegedly left his property to make a delivery at 6 a.m. on August 18, 1997. He was supposed to be heading to Miami for said delivery, according to his wife, Carole. He often made trips, so it wouldn't seem too far-fetched. Though after this, Don was never seen again. 3 days after this supposed trip, Carole reported the disappearance to the police after no contact had been made to his family or friends. And from that point on, an investigation was carried out. Carole had hired her own private investigator also. The only thing the police had found was a van parked in the car park of a private airport that Lewis was known to have owned planes in, Pilot County Airport. The police say they found his keys inside of the vehicle, but no evidence was discovered in the van. None of Don's credit cards had been used, and seemingly all of his possessions that were known about were not missing. There is a possibility, because of his expired license, that there were planes that weren't known about, but other than that, he vanished completely without a trace. Police very quickly, or maybe irresponsibly, dismissed the idea of foul play after investigation of the Wildlife and Easy Street Sanctuary. Police then headed to Costa Rica, which realistically seemed to be the most likely place to find him, considering that he owned large properties there and was known to travel there quite a lot. They searched his 200-acre park in the town of Bagaces. The police discovered evidence of extramarital affairs he had been partaking in, which was to no surprise, and also discovered some documents which pointed to illegal business practices. But other than that, there was no evidence discovered proving that he may have fled to the town. After 5 days of investigation, it was considered a dead end, and they left Costa Rica. The investigation remains open, but Don Lewis was declared dead in 2002 after 5 years of disappearance. But the mystery rages on. The prime suspect of the disappearance, too, maybe not even in the police's eyes, but in the public, family members, and friends of Don Lewis's eyes, was Carole. Shortly before his disappearance, there were many disputes between Carole Baskin and Don Lewis. The nature of Don was that of a man who struggled to stay loyal, which could very well affect the relationship. But there was evidence that Don Lewis was afraid of Carole and wanted to get a divorce because of this. Lewis had filed a restraining order against Carole Baskin, and it claimed in the document that he was actively afraid of her, stating, "This is the second time Carole has gotten angry enough to threaten to kill me." He had also claimed that she had hidden his .357 pistol. The restraining order was rejected by the judge and thrown out. His assistant, Anne McQueen, kept a copy of it. Furthermore, this was not the only restraining order filed against Carole by former lovers. In 2002, an ex-boyfriend, Jay Bakell, had also allegedly made some suspicious claims about Carole. He said that she carried 2 guns on her at all times, claims that he thought he was in real danger of death after she threatened to evict him, due to the fact that her previous husband went missing. He also mentioned that when he had asked her about what would happen if her husband showed up again, she responded, oddly, "Dead bodies can't talk." The friends and family of Don Lewis believed that she had killed Don for financial gain, and that the divorce was threatening the wealth they had accumulated, and, even worse, that she might lose her beloved cats. They believed that Carole Baskin not only killed him, but also fed him to the tigers, covering his shoes in perfume for the lions to attack him when he entered the cages. It was claimed that Carole Baskin had broken into the office of Don Lewis's assistant and had stolen the prospective will that had been written by Lewis. The will that was written was very suspicious, including leaving the whole estate to Carole, neglecting the 4 children he had fathered in his previous marriage. The family even claimed that he was close to them and had expressed worries about Carole to them, which implies they had a relationship. The most suspicious part, however, was the fact that the will included a stipulation where Baskin would not only receive his estate if he died, but also if he had gone missing. Now, to me, nobody plans for their disappearance, and if he had disappeared, why would he be in favor of handing over all of his estate when he could possibly reappear? Carole had faced legal challenges from the children of Don Lewis and had fought for Lewis's estate, with the daughters of Lewis receiving very little in comparison. During the investigation, the police also neglected to make a DNA analysis of the meat grinder that was on Carole's property or really make any substantial efforts to investigate. This is a criticism that has been echoed by a lot of her opponents, and a lot of the evidence that could have been collected has now been lost after the years, simply due to the amount of time that had passed and the time they had potentially lost searching Costa Rica. It's very possible that Carole had directed the police towards Costa Rica once they had initially ruled foul play out of the question, giving her enough time to remove evidence. This is just speculation though. Furthermore, the way Carole conducts herself in interviews has drawn mass skepticism also. Carole doesn't appear to be genuine when she is being interviewed. The way she speaks about the disappearance seems very detached, speaking about her husband's potential death insensitively. For example, Carole seems to laugh during questioning, expressing somewhat nervous laughter at some inappropriate moments. She says things like, while laughing, "I couldn't even put his hand in the meat grinder, let alone his whole body." And to add further suspicion, she even makes suggestions on how you could feed someone to the tigers, dismissing the idea that she had covered his shoes in perfume to attract the tigers. She says, "If I were gonna, if somebody wanted to kill you, then they would put sardine oil all over you. Something the cat wants to eat, not something the cat wants to drool on." Some people have taken this as a semi-confession as to what might have happened, and fueled theories that she had covered her husband in sardine oil and fed him to the tigers. A body language expert that runs a channel called Believing Bruce, who you might recognize from some of True Geordie's boxing streams if you're a sports fan like me, claims that due to certain aspects of her body language, she may be hiding some truths. An example he presented was when Carole was asked whether or not she had threatened her husband. When she answered this question, she obviously said no, claiming in other interviews that they didn't even fight. Well, when she answered this, Bruce noticed that she had pursed her lips. Now, according to him, when somebody does this, it's a sign that they are hiding something that they are thinking about, implying that Carole isn't being totally honest. Another example was when she was asked about why she didn't have a memorial for Lewis. Usually, when someone is trying to rummage through memories, or even feeling emotional, they look downwards. Carole, however, didn't do this. Instead, keeping eye contact and staring straight forward towards her interviewer, answering the question very quickly. This implies that she may be making up some of her answers. I'd recommend having a watch of the video and making up your mind about this, because, once again, this is speculation and I don't want to claim that Carole has definitely murdered her husband because she looked down in a video or put her lips in a certain position, but it's definitely interesting to have a think about. Now, following the release of the Netflix documentary Tiger King, Carole Baskin attempted to make a rebuttal of these claims, and because I find it interesting, and for the sake of fairness, we're going to have a look at them. We'll start with the accusation of feeding her husband to the tigers. Now, putting aside the fact that the investigation was poorly executed, the problem with the being eaten by the tigers theory is the fact that tigers will struggle to process bones. So, if he was fed to the tigers, Carole would have had to find another way to dispose of the bones. If the bones were still on her property, and if they were disposed elsewhere, it is very likely that they would have turned up somewhere, and she would have to make a real effort to get rid of them. While Carole does seem fairly smart and manipulative in some senses, I don't exactly know how capable she is at concealing evidence, but it's not too far-fetched to assume that she might have disposed of them. It does not rule out the fact that she could have fed them to the tigers and got rid of the bones. It just proposes that it's quite a difficult feat to do, but it's very possible. The meat grinder theory had also been debunked by Carole. According to Carole, the meat grinder would not have been able to process the bones also, and, as claimed by Carole, the meat grinder was not on the property at the time, being moved weeks before, and that the meat grinder was not an industrial meat grinder, but a small, hand-powered one. So, this effectively refutes the meat grinder theory. To me, the most interesting theory, and, if not true, pretty damning for Carole, is that she claimed his mental health was deteriorating. Baskin apparently started noticing strange behavior from Don, which she concluded may have been some early signs of Alzheimer's disease. He had been previously diagnosed with bipolar according to Carole, and had an MRI booked before he ended up going missing. According to Carole, some of these strange behaviors included dumpster diving. She claimed that she had even received a call from Lewis asking for help after he got stuck in a dumpster. He was in tears and, apparently, didn't know where he was. He also started hoarding junk, which she disapproved of. and Lewis was very defensive about. This leads onto the restraining order that he had filed. The restraining order was made because apparently Carole was trying to get rid of the junk he had hoarded up. This does make sense, because it was mentioned in the restraining order that she was trying to get rid of some of his possessions. According to her, she never threatened his life, as said in the document, and the mention of fearing his life may have been added so that the judge took the claim more seriously. Another theory put forward was that she had hidden his body in a septic tank, devised by Joe Exotic of the GW Zoo. Baskin claims that they didn't install the tank until a while after Lewis's death. And even though Joe Exotic is an entertaining character, his theories aren't exactly watertight. Finally, for the strange stipulation in the will about his disappearance was that it was a precaution made due to prior dealings with organized crime, and that people go missing in Costa Rica quite often. It was apparently a mutual decision between the two of them, and was planned in the event that he did go missing in Costa Rica. It does not, however, explain why the estate went pretty much entirely to Carole Baskin. So, with the rebuttal out of the way, we can start to speculate about what may have happened. And trust me, this is purely speculation, because there isn't really much evidence for any of this aside from anecdotes and claims that are made by other people within the big cat industry. So take this all with a pinch of sardine oil. One theory proposes that Lewis was thrown out of a helicopter by members of an organized crime family. A former attorney of his had proposed that he had gone to check out a helicopter for a potential purchase, where he then got in the helicopter for a test drive with two men. Once in the helicopter, Lewis then would have been taken over to the Gulf of Mexico and pushed out of the aircraft by members of an organized crime family that he may have double-crossed. This theory could be true, considering that Don Lewis was involved with crime organizations and was allegedly embezzling money. This could also be backed up with the police's discovery in Costa Rica of illegal dealings. With Lewis's secrecy, this is quite plausible, but the problem is that there is no evidence to this claim. Why would he tell Carole that he was heading to Miami to make a delivery, instead of telling her that he was going to go purchase an aircraft he had done many times before? To me, it seems like a scenario that is more of a best guess than anything else, and there isn't enough evidence to back any of this up. Another theory proposed is that he fled to Costa Rica under a false identity to get away from Carole, his prior baggage with organized crime families, and to live out a new life. A caretaker on the 200-acre property Lewis owned claimed that he had spotted Lewis in Costa Rica post-disappearance. Other than this though, there have not been any other sightings of the man. This theory could be possible due to his apparent dealings with organized crime families, and it would be an effective way to flee Carole and his baggage that he had carried. But the issue here is that he had properties worth a lot of money, and the police had found no evidence that he had been to Costa Rica after his disappearance. It also raises the question, why would he leave his estate to Carole, forgetting about his daughters, and leaving them, his fortune, and cats, to live a new life at the age of almost 60? He also hadn't used any of his credit cards, so it doesn't make sense. I suppose he could have buried some of his money in Costa Rica, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense why he wouldn't prepare beforehand before leaving. Lastly, this is one I've had a thought about based off of Carole's Alzheimer's claims, because while her claims are interesting, they don't really lead anywhere, and in some ways they actually raise more questions than they answer, mainly leaving the question unanswered as to how someone who was unstable such as that could leave no trace at all to his disappearance. He could have possibly taken a flight in an unregistered plane he had owned, which isn't impossible, seeing that he was flying without a valid license anyway prior to his disappearance. He could have taken this plane and tried to make a trip to Costa Rica, and while in the air, forgot how to maybe operate the plane, or had made a bad decision influenced by his deteriorating condition, and crashed into the ocean, making the wreckage very difficult to find, especially in 1997. But, like with most of these theories, however, there isn't much real evidence to back this up though, and once again, this is purely speculation on my part. It's a difficult case because there isn't really much evidence at all apart from claims and anecdotes. The big cat industry is also pretty antagonistic towards Carole, rightfully or wrongly, but the claims are based in some self-interest. I personally think there is more evidence pointing towards Baskin, because a lot of the claims that she makes in response to the criticism can be debunked just as much as she can try to debunk their claims. But while I'm not too sure if she killed him, she certainly seems to me to be hiding something. Not long after the documentary released, the Hillsborough Police Department in Florida had once again opened up for possible leads, considering the new exposure to this previously obscure case. And I think that's an important point to make with this case. There isn't much details about this apart from what was uncovered in Tiger King, and I try to write this from an unbiased perspective and sort of get a perspective based off of what I've read rather than what I've watched. So like I said, you should realistically take a lot of the information in this with a pinch of salt because while I believe most of it to be true, there could be some details that Carole Baskin and other members that were close to Don Lewis could be hiding. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried my best to include as much detail as possible, even though it is pretty hard to find anything concrete. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and share the video if you found it at least a bit interesting. This has been Roland Reads. Until next time.